Hello, my name is Matt. This is attempt number 2 at going through my notes on the actual abolition of man. Um, yeah, let's get right into it. Before we start, I have some housekeeping to do. In the description, there's going to be some useful resources, like a link to the full text in PDF form online. A link to a narration that I really liked. It's by a channel called CSLewisDoodle. Um, and they have really cool uh, narration. I think is better than most audiobooks, and also these drawings to go along with it. And the drawings are optional and they're kind of fun. And there will also be an outline of my notes and like a PDF of these slides if you want to look at those and dig into them. And secondly, I want to go over why exactly I'm doing this. And it mostly comes down to a man called Paul Vanderklay, or PVK. Paul has these cool videos where he will just riff on certain subjects or videos that he's found. And he's a really prolific video maker. I'm trying to make this video really made me appreciate how many videos he makes. And he'll go for 2 or 3 hours at a time. It's really amazing. And when I was trying to schedule a conversation with him, I noticed that he said, consider starting your own channel. Others have done it. Consider editing down your group conversation, and if it's good enough, maybe I'll post it. Maybe I'll start a sub-channel. I don't know yet. So even if he doesn't see this video, or if it's not up to snuff to like share it or whatever, I thought it'd be productive to make it just for my own entertainment and for the Discord group that he has, that I like talking to people on there, even though I'm relatively new. And so with that, I'll jump right into the overview, table of contents. We're going to start out with the lowercase s sin of Gaius and Titius, and how they kind of butcher the English language, and what they're really saying about judgments of value, and that involves some story about Coleridge, who's an English poet. Then that will lead into another person named Orbilius, and his criticism. He kind of falls in the same trap, and we're going to be outlining, or C.S. Lewis outlines, the blockhead and the ape, and finally we're going to end with an introduction to the Tao, or the Tao, which is really outlined in chapter 2. So the predicate and sentimentality. I'll go further into defining or looking into what the predicate means as a piece of English composition, and also as a logical thing. But first I need to start with the story of Coleridge going to the waterfall. And the text itself, or the example that is used in the book, is a little bit beside the point, and the real meat of it is in the criticism of how Gaius and Titius interpret it. So in this textbook called The Green Book that C.S. Lewis is reviewing, it's a book written for, I think, first-year English college students, and the authors go over the story about Coleridge, this English poet, going to a waterfall with 2 other chores. When they get to the waterfall, they see this waterfall, and the first tourist says, this waterfall is pretty, and then the second one says, this waterfall is sublime. And Coleridge rejected the first description of pretty, and he favored the second one, saying that this is sublime. And this is what Gaius and Titius have to say about that story. When the man said this is sublime, he appeared to be making a remark about the waterfall. Actually, he was not making a remark about the waterfall, but a remark about his own feelings. What he was saying was, I really have sublime... What he was really saying... What he was saying really... I have feelings associated in my mind with the word sublime. Or shortly, I have sublime feelings. But the authors are not yet finished. They add, this confusion is continually present in language as we use it. We appear to be saying something very important about something, and actually we are only saying something about our own feelings. And the assumptions that they make have some consequences, mostly that predicates of emotion are meaningless and trivial, and they're just describing something going on in ourselves. They are not describing something outside of ourselves, like the waterfall. They aren't rational, and they are unimportant. So the end conclusion you have to ask yourself after reading that is, do Gaius and Titius think emotions are something to be debunked? Are emotions something to be thrown away and not trusted? C.S. Lewis has this to say. They have treated only one particular predicate of value, sublime, as a word descriptive of the speaker's emotions. The pupils are left to do for themselves the work of extending the same treatment to all predicates of value, and no slightest obstacle has been such and no slightest obstacle to such extension is placed in their way. And why does any of that matter? Isn't this just a silly English, quibble? Um, well, what did Coleridge really mean by the waterfall? Even though he probably wasn't consciously thinking this, he thought that the object merited value. He wasn't saying that he thinks the waterfall is beautiful, but he was saying that he thought that the waterfall merited the descriptor of sublime. So he was recognizing beauty in something else. And that's an important difference. Value is something outside of emotion. Emotion, as we'll see later, is just like this deliverer of something. Beauty is something recognized. It's something that exists outside of ourselves. To Gaius and Titius, though, all sentences containing a predicate of value are about the emotional state of the speaker. And that's in their own words. And they think emotions are meaningless. So words used to describe objects don't describe our feelings about objects. And this is fairly obvious after it's pointed out to you, after Gaius and Titius are criticized for saying this. It's not something I actually caught on the first time I read the book. And I've probably read Abolition of Man 3 times now, and the third time I'm reading it with friends. And it wasn't something I caught until C.S. Lewis really criticized them for it. And what he says is that when we call a waterfall sublime, we are not describing our feelings. We are we in fact feel feelings of veneration and are humbled. So the feelings that are going on inside of us aren't even sublime. If they were sublime, when we looked at a waterfall, we would feel only ecstasy or something like that. We would feel unreasonably happy. It'd just be this instinct that bubbled up inside of us. When in fact we feel humbled by it. Or at least when we say something is sublime, we feel humbled by it. And then after you recognize that when we describe something with words, that we aren't really just describing something that's going on inside of our heart or inside of our chest, that Gaius and Titius are building an argument about value on a fallacy. Their argument is built on sand, kind of. And once that's pointed out, it's kind of like the rug is pulled out from under them, and we're left with some other questions. But the important point that C.S. Lewis has to make about this English textbook as a textbook is that when a child is being educated, they won't know the difference. And the adoption of this thought process might be the unraveling of human society, is what he says. And that's really continued outlined in chapter 2. So what is a predicate? Well, if you look at the bottom of this page right here, right down there, I think that's really the definition that we're concerned about. State, affirm, or assert something about the subject of a sentence or an argument of proposition. A word that predicates something about its subject. So the predicate is part of English composition, but it's also saying that you're describing something, you're putting a value on it, and you're judging it based on its value. Gaius and Titius have taken the predicate, judgment, of value and called it irrational, unreasonable, and silly. Well, what does that mean? If if all your judgments are silly and irrational because they're really describing something that's going on in here that's irrational, and you extend that to all values of judgment, and particularly moral judgment, then where does that leave you? So here we go on to our third author here, Orbilius, and I should point out that these are all pseudonyms. They're not the real authors, but you can go and find the original books that C.S. Lewis was criticizing here. In another little book, whose author I will call Orbilius, I find that the same operation under the same general anesthetic is being carried out. Orbilius chooses for debunking a silly bit of writing on horses, where these animals are praised as the willing servants of the early colonists in Australia. He contents himself with explaining that horses are not secundum litterum, no idea if I'm saying that right, not literally interested in colonial expansion. This piece of information is really all that his pupils get from him. Why the composition before them is bad, when others that lie open to the same charge are good, they do not hear. And that's an important point. Why the composition before them is bad, when others that lie open to the same charge are good. So some authors use this method of writing non-literally, and they're praised for it. Well, they can be criticized under these same grounds that Orbilius is laying out here. That, oh, what you're saying is not literal. Well, that he's just debunking metaphors and hyperbole. I have a stupid meme right there about that. The point of a metaphor is that it isn't literal. Pretty much everybody knows that, except for a child. By pointing out that a metaphor is non-literal is simply saying that it is a metaphor. We already knew that. But for a student, they may not know better. They're left to extend the same treatment for all metaphors with no obstacle in their place. It's just this other thing of the same general anesthetic is what he says. He's making the same mistake as Gaius and Titius in a way. And to answer that question about, well, if all predicates of value can't be trusted, basically, that they're irrational things that shouldn't be trusted, whether based on the emotional core or, this non-literal metaphorical core, which really is an appeal to emotion. Like when we were saying that everybody was kung fu fighting, that's kind of an appeal to emotion of like, oh, everybody? That's a lot of people. But we know literally that's not what's happening. It's hyperbole, and we're saying a lot of people, and that's supposed to get a reaction out of us. Well, when those things are removed, we're left with kind of these blockheads and trousered apes, is what C.S. Lewis calls them. Much less do they learn of the two classes of men who are respectively above and below the dangers of such writing. The man who really knows horses and really loves them, not with anthropomorphic illusions, but with ordinate love, and the irredeemable urban blockhead, to whom a horse is merely an old-fashioned means of transport. Some pleasure in their own ponies and dogs they will have lost. Some incentive to cruelty or neglect they will have received. Some pleasure in their own knowingness will have entered their minds. That is their day's lesson in English, though of English they have learned nothing. Another little portion of human heritage has been quietly taken away from them, before they were even old enough to understand. So, irredeemable urban blockhead, that's a really strong statement. I'm actually going to criticize Lewis here and say that urban blockheads are redeemable. I'll get to that in a second. But the point he's making is really important, and he goes to another passage here with Gaius and Titius where they also kind of critique this advertisement that's saying that you'll receive all this adventure, and he admits it's like a silly piece of writing, but the way Gaius and Titius criticize it is the exact same way of saying you won't literally get this adventure. You won't literally sail the same seas as Drake or that other guy who went around the globe. Oh boy, what was his name? Magellan. You won't really sail the same oceans as them. You won't be on that same level of adventure. He, the student, will have no notion that there are two ways of being immune to such an advertisement, that it falls equally flat on those who are above it and those who are below it, on the man of real sensibility, and on the mere trousered ape who has never been able to conceive the Atlantic as anything more than so many millions tons of cold salt water. So here we're seeing two classes, I'd argue three classes of men, because urban blackheads and trousered apes are kind of different. The person who's above the things realizes that it's hyperbole, but they know trained in them to recognize it and replace it with a real quote unquote sentimental value. So what really makes a blockhead? I found this paper that was really good. It was on education and C.S. Lewis, and it's all about urban blockheads and these trousered apes. And he puts it like this. The urban blockhead has data, but no knowledge. He is an informed ignoramus. And if you think about it, what does that mean? It means that this person has a lot of data, but they don't know how to apply it really. They have all this data, they're not speaking untruthfully, but at the same time they can miss the entire point. And I think you already know where this is going. So we all know the person who corrects technically without understanding the underlying discussion. Technically right, but wrong in every other way. And there is a term associated with it. Well, actually. And so this brings us to what I think is a prime example of this. I'll pull up this example. Is the know-it-all from the Polar Express. And I just found this to be very eye-opening. The know-it-all is one of the children that rode on the Polar Express. He's talkative and seems smart at first, but it is soon apparent that he only wants to be smart and needs the ability to learn more. Hero Boy first meets Know-it-all on the train right after he takes a seat. Know-it-all asks the boy if he knows what kind of train they are on, leaving him confused. Hero Girl joins in the conversation and answers correctly that answers the question by saying that it is a magic train that goes to the North Pole. Know-it-all proceeds to give a detailed explanation of the train before noticing whoever that guy is outside and goes to some other plot points. The story features a Christmas display with a pile of presents, to which Know-it-all exclaims, "I want all of them." Isn't that eye-opening? So when presented with all these facts, he says, "I want them all." And even in the most obvious circumstance, being on a magical train that's taking you to the North Pole, you'd think that'd be a very important fact. But Know-it-all proceeds to give a detailed explanation of the train itself. So seeing the details without really knowing what they're about. And that's not to say that they're dumb, just knowledgeable about, or kind of detail-oriented about things. Rational to an extent, knowledge without understanding. Which then leads us to our second character here, Trousered Ape. The distinctives of humanity, rationality, purpose, volition, and freedom, imagination, commitment, the image of God, were stripped away, leaving only instinct-driven, feeling-extolling, trousered apes. It's a quote from Polly Michelson. Actually, I think I misattributed that. I'll correct it in editing if that's the case. That's actually C.S. Lewis, and that's a quote from the Abolition of Man that also appeared in that paper that I was talking about. So we see that the trousered ape is some instinct-driven creature. They're not smart, and they're driven entirely by the belly, by these instincts that drive them this way and that. And interestingly enough, Polly Michelson points out that in the Chronicles of Narnia, there is a trousered ape. And it appears he's I think he's the final instigator in the last battle, the very last Chronicles of Narnia book. And he points out this passage specifically. Then the ape spoke. "I hear some of you saying that I'm an ape. Well, I'm not. I'm a man. If I look like an ape, that's because I'm so very old, hundreds and hundreds of years old. And it's because I'm so old that I'm so wise. And it's because I'm so wise that I'm the only one Aslan is ever going to speak to. He can't be bothered talking to a lot of stupid animals. He'll tell me what you've got to do, and I'll tell the rest of you. And take my advice and see you do it in double quick time, for he doesn't mean to stand any nonsense. And so we see that this trousered ape specifically, I forget what he's called, he has different underlying motivations now. He is not just an idiot, but he's an idiot with motivations. Um, and the point of this ape is that he's only a parody of what a real person is. A purposeful creature without purpose. A one-way trip to Pleasure Island. Last night I just watched Pinocchio, and I couldn't help but thinking about this parable of Pleasure Island. And you see Pinocchio go to Pleasure Island and he starts smoking cigars, drinking, playing pool, what else? Destroying things. Very instinct-driven desires, and it turns him into a jackass. Somebody who becomes subservient to somebody else.
Hear that beetle talk? You'd think something was gonna happen to us. Conscience. Nah, phooey. Where does he get that stuff? How'd he ever expect to be a real boy? What's he think I look like? A jackass?
You sure do.
I think that's an important detail. And one reason I want to defend blockheads is that I am definitely tend towards being a blockhead. I'm an engineering student, electrical engineering. I love science. I'm a fan of it. And one word that could be easily applied to me is that I'm a reductionist. G.K. Chesterton has this great quote in Orthodoxy where, and I'm going to paraphrase here, where he says that insane people are sometimes the most rational people because they're able to reduce their worldview down to this tiny little box, and the world is small enough that they can understand every part of it. And that's what being a reductionist really is, I think. And it's a great way to make blockheads, taking out this emotional core and saying that facts are the only thing, or sorry, scientifically deduced facts are the only thing, is like a recipe for blockheadery. And there's a difference between the love of scientific knowledge and scientific knowledge as an end in itself. And I'd argue, and I think C.S. Lewis really argues this in the next chapter, that love of scientific knowledge in and of itself is actually an ideal that doesn't really exist. That other motivations start creeping in when you make that the end value that you have. And you see it all kind of with Know-It-All Kid and in Pinocchio, that either you become subservient to another person, literally, as in Pinocchio, when they become literal jackasses, donkeys that are sold off into slavery, and they're underneath this other malevolent power, or you're a blockhead who is kind of turned into a trousered ape. To be honest, I think that's really the trousered ape and the blockhead are more connected than is outlined in the book. And so this leads us into the Tao, which is the first alternative, or the alternative that we're given to these subjective values that Gaius and Titius lay out. Gaius and Titius, see the world around them swayed by emotional propaganda. They have learned that from tradition that youth is sentimental, and they conclude that the best thing they can do is fortify the minds of young people against emotion. Is everything propaganda? Can emotions be trusted? Is there a hint of truth at all in propaganda? And what are emotions good for anyway? What is the Tao? I personally don't like the name, the Tao. I think what C.S. Lewis was trying to do is present you with like an alien notion, so you approach it from like a million miles out, and that it wasn't confused with like um, traditional values or religious values, although they kind of are one and the same thing. I like the alternative name that he gave it, which are the first platitudes, and you see that a platitude is a banal, trite, or stale remark. But that's how it's usually used in English language. But a platitude is something that I think is self-evident. Like, well, we should all be nice, is a platitude that doesn't really add anything to the conversation because most people agree that everybody should be nice, um, or so you think. Um, and to the best of my ability, the Tao is what traditional morality is. And in my reductionist engineering mindset, it's a set of moral axioms that are of irreducible complexity. So one doesn't exist without the others, and they exist as like one package. They're universal morals, and they're the foundation. We find these truths to be self-evident, one very famous document says. And the fact that the Tao is universal means a lot. It's outlined in the appendix what these universal values are. They're the truth of real rights and real wrongs that exist outside of what we're thinking in our head. They're not just values that we place on things, they exist outside of us, and we need to recognize that. An objective moral truth is what they are. It is the doctrine of objective value, the belief that certain attitudes are really true and others really false to the kind of thing the universe is and the kind of thing we are. Those who know the Tao can hold that to call children delightful or old men venerable is not simply a record of psychological fact about our own parental or familial emotions at the moment, but to recognize a quality which makes demands a certain response from us, whether we make it or not. So it does not depend on our emotion, what these values are. And C.S. Lewis goes on to say, I myself do not enjoy the society of small children, because I speak within the Tao. I recognize this as a defect in myself, just as any man may have to recognize that he is tone deaf or colorblind. So there's an interesting fact that Gaius and Titius have come to the conclusion to based off of their own assumptions, is that we can recognize this value and correct ourselves to that value. Gaius and Titius have assumed the Tao as something subjective and meaningless. That's what it's all about. Since all predicates of value are merely about our own emotions, and emotions themselves are irrational and shouldn't be trusted, where does that leave the student? Where's where they're to go other than straight down? And that's really outlined in chapter 2. And I'd argue that what Gaius and Titius are creating are a basis for subjectivism. And you can pause that and read it if you want. There's another really good C.S. Lewis essay about subjectivism that I'll try to include. But this is where it's really leading us, is moral subjectivism, which is a really popular thought right now. And here we go at the end of the chapter with this concept of men without chess. So Gaius and Titius have been arguing this whole time, and Orbilius to an extent, that the emotions, these things that can't be trusted, should just be cut out. And that's what the chess is an emotional response, trained emotional response. We are told this, we were told it all long ago by Plato. As the king governs by his executive, so reason and man must rule the mere appetites by means of the spirited element. Our emotions are liaison officers that communicate between the cerebral man and the visceral man, what's called the stomach. So through the chest, head governs through the chest to the stomach, and perhaps the other way around too. they're essential to being human. You cannot cut out emotion without becoming less human or non-human. And yet we're trying to cut them out of our being, either by educational conditioning or mistrust of our emotional faculties. And we'll see that cutting out emotion is something that it's it's a futile effort. Yet we have educators like G&T educating children to distress all emotion. And where does that lead the student? We've been asking that whole time. Well, it creates urban blockheads of trouser apes, and at the end product of an urban blockhead and a trouser ape is a cynic. The urban blockhead and the trousered ape have already been discussed. One more option exists, the cynic, probably the final destination. There's another article that I read that I'll include where they define as being cynical as this, skeptical of another's intentions. I might tack on one small addendum, says the author of this article. Cynicism includes skepticism of one's own motivations as well as others, for the attitude at root often stems from a crippling self-consciousness of our own hollow intuitions. This is something that David Foster Wallace talks about all the time, and that he is subject to in himself. I was in doing research for this PowerPoint. I found these clips where he's talking about cynicism, and then he's cynical about his own motivations for talking about cynicism.
When I was a little boy, there was a class called citizenship, and here are certain things about America and America's history. Here's why it's important to vote. Here's why it's important not just to go in and vote for who the best-looking candidate is. Here's what's really interesting, and I don't know if you can translate this. Talking about this now, I feel ashamed, because my saying all this sounds to me like an older person saying this, like a person lecturing, which in American culture sets me up to be ridiculed. It would be very easy to make fun of what I'm saying. You know, it'd be very, very easy to make fun of what I'm saying, and I can hear in my head a voice making fun of this stuff as I'm saying it. And this is the kind of paradox, I think, of what it is to be a halfway intelligent American right now, and probably also a Western European, is that there are things we know are right and good and would be better for us to do, but constantly it's like, yeah, but you know, it's so much funnier and nicer to go do something else, and who cares, and it's all bullshit anyway. And, sorry.
And I'll edit those in after this, because my laptop can't really handle recording and playing a video at the same time. And so what's the conclusion that that Lewis comes to at the end of this? Cutting out the chest, the atrophy of the chest, and leaving the head and the stomach, these animal desires. He says that we castrate and build the geldlings be fruitful. The Tao is the only defense against the invention of trousered apes, blockheads, cynics, and narcissism. Another kind of integral thing of being a cynic is being somewhat narcissistic. Emotion is something integral to being human, but also something to be trained. Failure to successfully train emotion makes men subservient to other things, even his own animal desires, becoming a jackass, right? Scripture, Luther tells us, Martin Luther, describes man as so curved in upon himself that he uses not only physical but even spiritual goods for his own purposes, and in all things seeks only himself. This is said quite succinctly in another way, the Bible. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately corrupt. Who can better understand it? If you cut out emotion as a faculty that should be trained and trusted, then you're creating jackasses. And we'll talk about that more in chapter 2. Maybe I'll make a second video if this one goes over well. When we really go into the way and how cutting out an emotional core in humans is really a futile effort. It never goes away. It's either trained or it's untrained. And if it's untrained, that leads you to follow your desires, these animal desires, contrary to your reason. So that's the conclusion I've come to in this chapter. That's what I really think that C.S. Lewis was getting at about the Tao, these sort of universal morals that are defense against these animal instincts that serve to destroy us if not trained, and they can only be trained through this emotional core, which is commanding us through here. Anyway, thanks for watching. I appreciate it. If you have any criticisms of my notes or want to leave feedback at all, leave a comment, and I'll do my best to respond.